right, in today's video, I want to talk a little bit about theoretical versus practical internal auditing. Now, should kind of seem a little bit obvious, but I was actually having a conversation yesterday with a couple of chief audit executives, and we were talking about this, especially as it relates to standards. And, I think that a lot of times we get caught up in trying to be theoretical and often kind of miss the mark about being practical. And so in this video, I want to talk about why it is so important to, at the end of the day, be practical. That's more important than being theoretical. And some different ways that internal audit can be more practical in what you're doing. Okay. So the first thing is, you might be sitting there saying, well, now just a minute, it's more important to be practical than theoretical. What do you mean, right? Because, it's important. There's certain theory, there's certain aspirations that we have as internal audit, and it's important that we, do something about that. Well, just like it's more important to be effective than it is to be efficient, same thing. It's more important to be practical than it is to be theoretical. Now, if you can have both, wonderful. Just like if you can have both efficiency and effectiveness, that's great. But the primary focus should be on effectiveness and on practicality first and foremost, right? And let me just give you some flavor for this, and then we'll jump into talking about how internal audit can be more practical. Okay, now we can sit here, if we were, hanging out, having dinner, maybe we're having drinks or sitting on the porch just talking. It's kind of fun sometimes to just talk about theory. And, in my family, often we talk about, we'll sit around and we're solving all the world's problems, right? Because we have the answers in theory. And we're debating it, going back and forth, and we think that we're right. Now, it's the same thing that you see in, politics and some other things, especially here in the U.S., we're in an election year. And so a lot of times politicians will throw out theory, right, of what they would like to do, or these new policies that they want to implement. And they sound wonderful. They sound wonderful in theory, but they're often very difficult to actually put into practice or to make practical, right? And so that's why a lot of times as people are coming up with some of these things, they never get applied, right? Because we're just talking theory that you can't actually practically apply. And I'm seeing that in internal audit as well, okay? And so I'm going to go through and talk about a few different areas, some around certifications, standards, around the audit plan, independence, and some things like, who internal audit reports to, and talk a little bit more about some practical applications instead of the theory. Okay. Now, the first one, let's just talk about the standards a little bit. So the IIA came out with new standards. Now, first off, internal audit does not even necessarily need standards, okay? And I've talked about that before on some other live videos. But let's say that they do, right? Now, in theory, right, a lot of these standards are trying to push forward some theory that people in internal audit want to have happen. Right? They want internal audit to be seen as a profession similar to other professions like lawyers or CPAs. They want to see internal audit being a more important part of any organization. Okay. And again, these are good things in theory, and I understand the theory behind it, but the practicality is not really there for most of these things. And so let's start with standards, right? The new standards are very prescriptive. In theory, they want internal audit to be similar. They want consistency across organizations and how people are auditing. Now, in theory, That sounds wonderful, but in practicality, that does not work. Why? Because organizations are different, right? Is there a standard on how, if you're a food and beverage company, that you have to run your business? No. There may be certain, quality control things, especially in something like food. And again, I worked at food manufacturing companies. There were certain good management practices that we needed to follow. There were certain regulations that we needed to follow, right? But we did not run our business the same as other food and beverage companies. Okay. Same thing with banks. Again, if you're a bank, similar size bank in a similar, two similar banks in a similar region, providing effectively the same services to the same customer base, they're not going to run their business the same way. And so just like businesses don't run themselves the same way, internal audit cannot be or should not be done consistently in every organization. That just doesn't make practical sense. Why? Because again, every organization is different, and internal audit needs to adapt, needs to be tailored to the particular context in which they're operating. Okay. And so again, that's why we see so many differences. So standards are great in theory, right? But the practical application of them is much more difficult. In fact, as I talk with CAEs who are trying to understand these new standards, trying to understand these new topical requirements, they're having a very hard time trying to figure out how they're going to do all these things, especially if they're going to comply, right, with very prescriptive things that are in these documents. Now, again, that's theory, and in theory, some people feel like they need to comply, but the reality and the practical nature is you need to conform, not comply. Now, when you are conforming, that means you're going to do things slightly different than other people may, but you're still, right, meeting the principles. And again, the old standards were much more principles based, right? Meet these principles. How you do it, we don't necessarily care. We'll give you some advisory documents on how we suggest you might do it to give you ideas, but at the end of the day, you need to conform, right? The problem is, again, now the standards are making it much more prescriptive, right? So they're actually calling more for compliance than conformance even, because in theory, they want everybody to be the same. Now, let's talk about that. In theory, it sounds great, but the reality is nobody is relying on internal audit's work in the public space like some of these other things are. And we'll just use CPAs and the external audit firms, right? There is a lot of consistency. There is a lot of requirements in their audit standards because their audit reports are reviewed and are made public. And the public relies on that information to make investing decisions. Okay. So that makes more sense, right? Because an investor doesn't want to have to dig into, well, how does PwC do it versus E&Y versus Deloitte, versus Baker Tilly versus, Jefferson Wells or whoever, right? Name the firm that you want. They want a consistent product because they're relying on it. Now, that's not the case in internal audit. So there's really no need for every internal audit department to operate the same way, to test the same way, to test the same things, to have a similar reporting structure. It doesn't matter, right, at that point. It sounds great in theory, but the practical is it doesn't need to be that way. Okay, so that's kind of standards, right? Certifications is another area, right? Where again, it's more important, in my opinion, And again, you can disagree with me if you want to, but in my opinion, certifications should be much more practical, right, than theoretical. Now, some certifications like the CIA are very theoretical, right? How do we know that? Because again, they're based on standards, the questions that are there. They are looking for a theoretically or academically correct answer instead of how people actually do it. Now, how do we know that? Right? Because again, you might be saying, well, Jason, that's not really true. Well, if you've ever taken the CIA exam, you probably have an idea of some of the questions that they ask. And isn't it interesting that people who have more practical experience have a harder time passing that exam than students right out of college who have only been taught theory? Okay, that's because that exam is theoretical. So there's other certifications that are out there. C-Risk Academy has a lot of them that are actually practical. So what's the difference, right? Well, you can get something theoretical, but then you don't know how to do your job because it's all theory, right? So you've learned this theory, but now you have to learn the practical of how you actually do it in the field, right? And in fact, this is a frustration that I hear from a lot of chief audit executives is they're hiring people that have theoretical knowledge, but they don't have any practical knowledge, right? Or they've learned something academically, they've memorized something from textbooks, but they have no idea how to actually audit, and they have to retrain them on how to actually audit their way, how to audit in a practical way as well, right? Because at the end of the day, you have to do a job, right? You've got a job to do. Now, certifications are another one where you can be more practical in what you're doing. And there's a lot of practical certifications that are out there. Okay. Again, if you're curious, you can message me. You can go to C-Risk Academy. I can share with you some other ones that are out there as well, because certification should be a way for you to learn and be able to apply what you're learning practically. Okay. Another area, audit planning, okay, and coming up with your audit plan. So again, a lot of times there is this disconnect between theoretical and practical when it comes to the audit plan. Sometimes, heads of audit like to go away in their little ivory tower and they do their little magic, and they come up with what they think in theory are the highest risks in the organization. And maybe they're using risk, maybe they're using controls, maybe they're using compliance requirements. It depends on the centric approach that they're using to do the risk assessment and the audit plan. And I've talked a little bit about that before in some of the other videos. Now, again, so what happens often is you go away and you come up with this theoretical plan. These are the areas that we think we should audit this year because you think they're the areas that you should audit. Now, a lot of times we end up getting feedback from management. Management is much more concerned with being practical than theoretical. Okay. And that's a divide between internal audit and management often. Management is much more practical than internal audit is. And that's one of the reasons why you end up having contention between some of the management team and what you're trying to do. So again, in this area, as an example, you might have this theoretically beautiful audit plan. These are the things that we need to audit this next year. But practically speaking, they're not actually the risks that are practical and that are most immediate and most relevant to the organization. Again, why do we know that? Because so much of the time, the areas that internal audit chooses to audit And then they come back with these findings and these recommendations to management. They're not in alignment with what management is actually concerned with. So again, right? I've seen this over and over again, and I use this as an example sometimes. We'll do this great audit, and we think it's so wonderful, but we've kind of missed the mark. We're looking at an area that theoretically we should look at, but practically there's no reason to look at it. I'll give you a real life example. One is payroll. Okay, payroll. Now, a lot of people in internal audit think, oh, there's a risk of fictitious employees. There's a risk that we might be paying our employees incorrectly. It's a huge number on our financial statement. We have a lot of employees, and so there's a lot of transactions. And so that's an area that we need to go audit. Okay? That's the theory. But here's the practicality. Payroll in every organization is one of the most controlled of any of the processes. There are more controls in payroll almost than anywhere else. Probably payroll and accounts payable have some of the tightest controls. In fact, sometimes they're so tight that it is hard for a business to actually do business. Okay? But let's go back to payroll, right? Because again, you may be thinking, oh, we need to be auditing payroll. And so you do. And you find some area, maybe it's a few $100,000 where the company isn't doing something exactly right. And so you go back to management and you say, hey, we have this finding, these certain documents were not signed off on or whatever else. And it's a $200,000 impact finding. And we present that to management, and management kind of scratches their head or scratches their beard, right? If they got a beard like me. And they don't understand why we're making such a big deal about something that's maybe a couple $100,000. Why? Because they're worried about a practical problem or challenge that they have that might be a $50 or $100 million area that they're concerned with. So why are we focusing on areas like payroll instead of actually looking at the strategic risks that executive management is concerned with? It goes back to this theory and practicality again. In theory, we think we're right, but the practical thing is we often are not, and we're looking in the wrong areas. Let me go back to payroll again. My opinion, but I think it is a waste of time for internal audit to look at payroll. It is so well controlled. There are so many people looking at it. And do you know what the number one key control is when it comes to payroll? If you mess up your payroll, how long do you think it's going to take before the employees tell you that you did something wrong? So the monitoring controls of every employee in that organization, checking their paycheck every 2 weeks, every month, they're going to let you know very quickly if something did not work. How do we know? Let's look at you, right? If you're working for an organization, I'm sure that you receive a paycheck and you know exactly how much money is supposed to go into your bank account every pay period. Now, how long would it take you to notify your employer if they forgot to pay you or if they paid you the wrong amount? Probably 1 day. Because you're going to look at your bank account and go, whoa, just a minute, I was supposed to have a different amount that was in there, right? And so as a result of that, payroll is so well controlled practically. I know in theory, you may think you need to audit it, but you're probably wasting time on little things. Sometimes I'll use the analogy of mosquitoes and crocodiles. And sometimes we are so worried about the mosquitoes that we don't even notice the crocodiles. The crocodiles are the ones that are going to kill you, not the mosquitoes. But again, if you've been in, some of these temperate climates where there are mosquitoes and crocodiles both, sometimes there's a lot of mosquitoes flying around your face and you're kind of swatting at them and you're worried about them and they're making this noise and you're walking through this swamp and you don't even realize, or you're not even paying attention to the alligator or the crocodile who's in the area, and boom, they got you, right? Because you're focusing on the mosquitoes. Focusing on the theory is like focusing on the mosquitoes and ignoring the crocodiles. That's a recipe for disaster at the end of the day. Okay. So that's another area where we can choose to be more practical than theoretical. Practically speaking, what really is going to help your organization the most? What areas should really be on your audit plan? Not what you think they are, not what the IIA might tell you that you should be auditing, not what a firm may tell you that you should be auditing, but what should you really be auditing? Okay. Now, another one relates back to kind of independence, objectivity, reporting lines. That's another one where, in theory, right, we think that, and again, kind of built into standards, is the fact that the chief audit executive needs to report administratively high in the organization and should report functionally to the audit committee. And that high is usually said, oh, it needs to be the CEO, right? But in theory, that sounds good, right? Because if I'm reporting to somebody higher in the organization, then in theory, if they support me, then everybody else below them should have to fall in line, right? So again, theoretically, let's say I'm a chief audit executive, I report to the CEO, and so if I have any disagreements with other people down the line, in theory, the CEO is going to step in and say, nope, other person, you need to listen to internal audit. They know what they're doing. Practically speaking, that doesn't happen, right? And that is not the way that you want it to happen, right? You need to be developing good working relationships with other people in the organization. You need to be negotiating and collaborating with other people. If you choose not to, right, it doesn't matter who you report to. You can report to the controller, but if you have good relationships with other people in the organization, it doesn't matter who you report to, because you don't have to use that as a stick to get people to listen to you. And the reality is, if you're using a stick to get people to listen to you, that will not work long term. Okay, again, if I come up to you, right, you know the concept of the stick and the carrot, right? If I come up to you with a stick and I start tapping you, right, to prod you, to get you to do something, right? If I hit you hard enough, you're probably going to react. But the minute the stick is no longer there, you're no longer going to do that. But if you use a carrot and you train animals, like dogs with treats and other things like that, they learn, right, at that point. And so they end up operating and doing things when there is no stick around. Okay. And again, internal audit, that's a practical application, something that we need to be doing more. Because again, in theory, who you report to, that sounds great. In theory, having an audit charter sounds great. In theory, having standards that you can take back to somebody and say, look, we have these standards. We're so important. You need to listen to us because look, here's the standards and this is the way we're supposed to do it. Again, that doesn't go over well with most people. If that's how you are trying to negotiate, you're just manipulating people and forcing them to do something against their will. And that never goes over well. Again, think about people in your life who are manipulative and try to control you and try to use external things like, oh, you just wait until your father gets home, right? Sort of a mentality. And again, you might be saying, well, that didn't even apply. Well, I've seen a lot of organizations where, again, it's no different than saying, you better listen to my recommendations or I'm going to tell the CEO on you. It's like children, right? Not how we should be doing it. Not how we should be doing it for the long term. That's not practical, and that is not, something that is sustainable, right? And so let's start being more practical, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who you report to. Internal audit is not actually independent of the organization. Why? Because you get paid by the organization. You work for the organization. And a lot of people say, well, but independent means that I can put anything I want on my audit plan, and management isn't going to they don't have any say over what I audit. I choose what I audit. Well, in the short run, it might work, but in the long run, what's going to happen? If you keep pushing and you keep pushing that way, eventually you're going to push yourself out of a job. And again, I see CAEs who get fired all the time. What's the usual reason for it? That. Because they're trying to push an agenda. They're trying to push theory instead of actually doing something that is practical. Because at the end of the day, as I said, we're not actually independent. You can say that theoretically all you want, right? But practically applying it doesn't work. Okay. So again, there's a couple of different ways, on how we can start to be more practical. Because as I told you at the beginning of this video, it is much more important to be practical than theoretical. And so, again, there's some people who feel like, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to push it. I'm going to make internal audit great again. I'm going to, everybody's going to see how valuable we are because I'm going to show them my charter, and I'm going to show them the standards, and I'm going to show them my certification, and that's going to make them believe me. Well, believe me, that does not work long term. It might work for weak executives, okay? But it doesn't work for the people who actually really think for themselves and actually have the personal power and executive presence. They're going to push back on you, and it ain't going to go anywhere. Okay. So let's stop trying to be so theoretical. Let's start being more practical. Why? First off, it makes your job a lot easier. Okay. If you're not trying to push a theoretical agenda, it's much easier. Right? You're not like Sisyphus trying to roll that boulder up the hill every day, right? It's a big task. Instead of, trying to change the world that way, what if you just change your world around you by actually being more of a team member, of working better and more collaboratively and negotiating with other people in the organization to find a solution that's right for your organization? Right? At the end of the day, don't do what's right for the IIA. Don't do what's right for the firms. Don't be a martyr for somebody else. Do what's right for you, what's right for your team, what's right for your organization. Because I will tell you, that is what internal audit was intended to do. When the people who started the IIA many, many years ago, and again, I've got the Victor Brink book and I've read it, how they envisioned internal audit is a lot different than what we're seeing today. And unfortunately, the theory, this utopian kind of ideal for internal audit to make us feel better, I'm guessing, is often driven by a few people. And it's kind of ego driven from what I can tell, unfortunately. And what I see is most people are kind of shaking their heads like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how I'm going to do this. Right? I talk to CAEs all the time who don't have the budget, who don't have the team, who don't have the skills on their team, who don't have the head count to be able to do most of these things. And they're sitting there shaking their head thinking, I can't do this. How am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? And then what often happens, unfortunately, is they start to feel less about themselves. Like, oh, I'm a really crummy internal auditor because I can't do it like this, Fortune 100 company that has 2,000 people in their internal audit department. Well, guess what? You're not supposed to be like that 2,000 person internal audit shop. You're supposed to be you. You're supposed to do it the way that is best for your organization. Okay. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. And that's, again, one of my hopes in this video is that if any of you are out there thinking that or shaking your head, it's like, throw out the theory, throw out other people's expectations, just be practical, do what's right for you, what's right for your team, and what's right for your organization. Because when you do, right, your job's going to be more fun. It's going to be more satisfying. Other people in the organization will actually start to see you as adding real value. But it means you have to throw out that theory. You have to throw out the ego that internal audit is so important, right? Because, again, in reality, no organization has to have internal audit unless it's regulated, okay? And again, you might be saying, well, no, right? This has to be the case. Well, let me ask you this. When did internal audit start? When did internal auditing start? Well, the IIA started, I think, in 1941, okay? And we've been, had these functions in organizations, maybe a little bit before that, going back to the early part of the 20th century, okay? Did organizations exist before internal audit was created? Yes. Did organizations make money before internal audit was created? Yes. Did companies go out of business before internal audit was created? Yes. And so some people might latch on that and say, look, we help it so that doesn't happen. Okay. But let's critically think about this. Have any companies gone out of business who had internal audit? Yes. Okay. So that's not even the real question, right? But again, I'm going to wrap up for today. But again, it's been my experience and how I've helped chief audit executives. Really, the more practical that you can be, the more tailored you can make your internal audit function to match the expectations of your stakeholders, your board, your management, your regulators. The more you're able to do that, the more fun the job is, the easier it is, the more the people in your organization end up seeing you as valuable. And to me, that's just a great thing, right? So again, believe me, don't believe me, do it, don't do it. It's up to you. But my suggestion is for you to consider, how can you start being more practical and less theoretical in what you're doing in internal audit. So with that, I'm going to wrap up for the day, and I'll see you in the next video.